This is number 50 in your notes, World War II European theater. So as we talk about this, we're going to be basically going through what happened on the European half of World War II. You'll notice, though, as we go through, we're not really discussing the Holocaust, as that will be its own separate set of notes, as it was such an important issue during World War II. So here we go. The build-up to World War II. In 1919, following World War I, Benito Mussolini rose to power and created a fascist government in Italy. He was the head of a political party known as the League of Combat. Mussolini used anger from the Treaty of Versailles to create a nationalist movement in Italy. The people in Italy weren't super happy, just like the people in Japan. Even though they were part of the Allies when World War I ended, they were kind of upset of the way that they had been treated, and so in a way they were lashing out and choosing somebody who was a little more extreme because they were upset with their political leaders. If you look to the right there, you can see Benito Mussolini. He was always famous for making sure that he was never portrayed as, ugly or fat or anything like that. Just like you see people on Instagram these days. He very famously was afraid of having a double chin in any of his pictures. And so he always was careful to make sure that he was always photographed sort of from above like that. Nazi Germany. They started to expand their control. In 1936, they took over Austria. In 1936, they took over the Rhineland. And so the Nazis controlled this small little piece of Germany, and they start to become larger and larger and larger in Central Europe. The Rhineland, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, all these little areas in Europe, they started to expand there because people were ethnically German. And so they might have spoke German or had German heritage, and Hitler used this as a justification basically to take over that land. He said, oh, well, these people really are German, and it just makes sense for us to sort of go and be one country. One interesting fact, in 1936, when Austria became part of Nazi Germany, they basically had voted to become part of Nazi Germany. The Austrians, unlike the other places in Europe that were taken over by the Nazis, the Austrians actually chose to join the Nazis. Fascist Italy. If you look at that sort of orangish part, you can see that in 1935 they took over Ethiopia, which had been very, very important because Ethiopia helps control the access to the Suez Canal. And in 1939, they took over Albania, which is the little tiny country there, sort of by the heel of the boot for Italy. Imperial Japan, which you can see in pink off to the right. In 1931, they take over Manchuria, which is a huge chunk of China just north of Korea. And in 1937, you can see that little splotch there. They took over China. Most notably, the nastiest violence was fought in a city called Nanjing, where 300,000 people were killed, and many of which were sexually assaulted by Japanese soldiers. World War II. In 1936, Hitler sends troops to the Sudetenland, south of Germany. France is willing to go to war to stop Hitler from annexing this land or from taking over the land, but Britain refuses to support France. And so what they do is they have to use the policy of appeasement. Just like a child who cries, you give them a piece of candy to appease them, to make them happy. It's a pacifier. Does it solve the problem? Not really, but it does get you a little further down the road. It gives you 5 minutes of quiet. So Hitler says, okay, if you give me this land, I promise not to take any more. And the British and the French are like, yes, you can have this, but no more. Hopefully war can be avoided and everyone can be happy. Here's a political cartoon. It's a very famous one. And you can see there's Neville Chamberlain, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And behind him is a worried Europe. You can see the child there is Adolf Hitler, and he is drinking from a bottle that says Munich Agreement, because at the Munich conference, that's where England and France decided to basically appease Hitler. And he has added concessions, which are just extra pieces of land and goodies that Hitler was given. The caption says, shh, he'll be quiet for now, maybe. Basically, you can see that they're not really solving the problem. They're just trying to calm things down. which is not a recipe for success in the long run. Here's another political cartoon. It says, "Remember, only one more lollipop, and then you all have to go home." This was created by Dr. Seuss, if you couldn't tell. And you can see there's a bunch of monsters that are coming out of the ocean or out of the sea, and they all have swastikas on them, representing the Nazis. And in the middle, there's a guy, and on his shirt it says "The Appeaser," and he's giving out just little candies. You can give away candy over and over and over, but eventually they'll never be happy, and they'll always want more. So it's a waste of time. It's not going to solve anyone's problems. It's just stalling for time. September 1st, 1939. This is the first day that World War II actually is considered to start. Hitler and Nazi Germany invade Poland, dividing the territory with the Soviet Union. So the Soviets and the Nazis agreed to basically split Poland in half, which was a really surprising move because Poland was right in between both of them. So for the Polish people, when they were attacked, they really had no way of stopping the Nazis and the Soviets. They were just overwhelmed. They were getting attacked from the east and from the west. It was just impossible to stop. Hitler and the Soviet Union leader, Joseph Stalin, signed a non-aggression pact agreeing to not attack each other. France and Great Britain said, "You've crossed the line," and they declared war on Germany. But the Nazis were prepared and rather quickly invaded and conquered France and Belgium. Hitler had seized all of continental Europe. So now the Nazis, in this just shock and awe, this super fast form of attack known as blitzkrieg, which is literally lightning war, they had gone and destroyed democracy's foothold in Europe. And so the only people that were holding on were Great Britain, because Great Britain has the English Channel and they're separated by this huge, 20-mile long chunk of water. And so it was the only thing that protected them from the Nazis storming them. If you look here, you can see the line of demarcation. So the Nazis and the Soviets drew these lines basically to decide what part of Poland would belong to who. And in the middle there, Warsaw would belong to the Nazis. There would famously be uprisings from the Polish people who would fight back and try to subvert and undermine the Nazis. The Germans made their first assault into Norwegian countries. They attacked Denmark and then Norway. Similar to the Schlieffen Plan in World War I, the Germans attacked Belgium and the Netherlands on their way towards France. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, probably. The Germans basically, they came in from the top and they went straight down. So they had some people go and take over Belgium and capture Brussels. They had other people that went to the ocean, guarding the English Channel to prevent the British from joining in with the French. And they went down into France and captured most of France relatively quickly. One other thing to note there is if you can see Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, and Ireland were all considered neutral countries, and Andorra. So these countries, basically, they were not an ally, they were not an Axis, they were not involved at all. Spain had fought its civil war in the 1930s, and so Spain and Francisco Franco, they just had no energy to be involved in the war. And Adolf Hitler, who was a friend of Francisco Franco, decided to keep Spain out of the war. Unlike World War I, the Nazis also attacked France from the south near the Ardennes. All right, moving on. The French had not anticipated that any army could make it through the dense Ardennes forest and left it basically unguarded. The German tanks ripped through the forest and surprised the Allied troops, forcing them back towards the French coast. 300,000 Allied soldiers were rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk. There was a really good movie in 2017 from Christopher Nolan called Dunkirk, which shows a bunch of British soldiers who had to be rescued and evacuated, a lot of which was done by civilians who just happened to own boats. But it was an unfortunate situation for the Allies where they really were just sort of trapped on the beaches at Dunkirk, and the Germans were shooting them like fish in a barrel. By June 22nd, 1940, France surrendered to Nazi Germany. The Nazis were able to take over almost all of France, and the Nazis installed a puppet government known as the Vichy. Many French citizens tried to flee south into northern Africa in order to find a way out of the Nazi-controlled territory. This was the plot behind the film Casablanca. So a lot of Europeans went down south to Africa, to places like Casablanca and Morocco, and they were looking for flights to Portugal or Spain, and then eventually flights to America, someplace away from the war. And so if you've ever seen Casablanca from 1942, that's basically the plot of that film. Here you can see Adolf Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. A very famous photograph. You can watch this on your own time, but it's the opening sequence for Casablanca. And so what it is basically a series of maps in which it shows the sequence that people had to take to escape Nazi-controlled Germany. So it starts at about 1 minute and 10 seconds. It goes from Europe and Spain, around Spain, through the Strait of Gibraltar. Oh my gosh, can't talk today. Eventually into Morocco, into Casablanca, where people would try to escape. It's worth watching. Winston Churchill. He is the Prime Minister of Great Britain following Neville Chamberlain. What he does is he says, "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." So this basically is his declaration to his people. He's saying, hey guys, listen, we have to stand here. We have to make our ground. If we surrender to the Nazis, there's no going back. There's no way out of this except fighting our way out of it. And so he very famously was sort of like stubborn like that, and he was able to stand up for a long, long time to the Nazis. If you take a look here, here's a map with the Axis advances. So you can see from the textbook that basically Germany is expanding, and you also have some challengers here. You have the United Kingdom, who's an ally, and you have the Soviet Union, who becomes an ally. The reason the Soviet Union becomes an ally is because when Hitler realizes after the Blitz that he can't go ahead and take over the United Kingdom, he says, oh, man, okay. And he goes and he turns his attention towards the Soviet Union. And so they attack the other half of Poland, and they start to attack Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the Soviet Union. Hitler eventually was going to attack the Soviet Union, so he figured, why not? Let's get it over with. After conquering France, Hitler turned his attention to the only threat he had left, England. And he began Operation Sea Lion, in which he planned to bomb Britain into submission. The German Luftwaffe focused heavily on bombing London. This was the Blitz. Many of the children and women in London were sent to the countryside. Those left in the cities were forced to hide in bomb shelters and in tube stations. By the way, for the Blitz, I have a whole video that I'll link below this one. After bombing England with German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, during a time period known as the Blitz, Hitler gave up on the idea of attacking England and turned his attention to the USSR. To the complete surprise of the Soviet Union, German troops began to invade Russia. The result was horrible for Russia. There were massive casualties. Millions of soldiers were killed, basically, and the Nazis were just sort of rushing into the Soviet Union. If you look, you can see there's a political cartoon there, and Hitler is stabbing Stalin in the back. He says, "Forgive me, comrade, but it seemed such a good opportunity." And you can also see that the Russo-German pact is being dropped by Stalin. In the summer of 1942, Hitler ordered his troops to attack Stalingrad, the city named after Joseph Stalin, in the Soviet Union. Stalingrad is responsible for creating many Soviet guns, tanks, and other weapons. It's a really big city and important to the Soviets. The Nazis surged forward in an attempt to take the city, and in a tactical move of genius, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. in which they basically surrounded the Nazis and were able to flank them. So if you look here at this diagram, you can see that the Nazis in blue have been surrounded by the Soviets. And so what happens is the Soviets, like a noose, are able to slowly move in closer and closer and closer and attack the Nazis. At the Battle of Stalingrad, there were some real moments of heroism, some really big contributors. The Battle of Stalingrad was fought building to building, and the Nazis were eventually surrounded. Thanks to snipers like Vasily Zaitsev, the Nazis eventually did surrender and were marched through all of Russia, through Moscow. 91,000 Nazi troops surrendered to the Soviets. 1 million Soviet soldiers died in the battle that went on for a little over a month, I believe. And the Nazis were eventually forced to surrender and retreat. You can see here's a photograph of Vasily Zaitsev. They made a movie about him called Enemy at the Gates, starring Jude Law, which is really worth watching. America joins the war. After the attack in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the United States joined the war and decided to engage the Nazis before the Japanese and the British were their closest allies. Does that make sense? Blech. After the attack in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the United States joined the war and decided to engage the Nazis before the Japanese, as the British were their closest ally. England would also serve as a home base prior to invading Nazi-occupied France. The Americans got a taste of war as they fought against the Nazis in North Africa prior to invading Europe. In July 1943, Benito Mussolini and his fascist government fell. He was executed in 1945. The new Italian government joined the Allies in fighting against the Nazis. You can see here that the leaders of the Italian fascist government were captured and strung up by their feet and, killed. As the Soviet Union suffered millions of casualties, British, American, and Canadian forces joined together in England to plan the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. After careful planning, including the creation of a ghost army made of balloons to mislead the Germans, the invasion was finally set for June 5, 1944. It would be delayed one day to June 6, 1944 because of poor weather. If you take a look at the image on the right, you can see there's a bunch of guys lifting up a tank, which is amazing. Now, part of the reason this is amazing is because, it's completely impossible. The reason they can lift it is because it is made out of balloons. The United States military hired a bunch of artists that would go around and create trucks and, have fake radio signals. They would have speakers hidden in bushes that would produce sounds of trucks, all kinds of things in order to make the Germans think that we were amassing our troops in one spot, when in fact that wasn't the truth. So the Germans thought we were going to attack from the left, and we ended up attacking from the right. And that's what really surprised the Nazis on D-Day. So if you're really interested in that, there's a PBS documentary called American Experience, The Ghost Army, and it's really, really good. It's really worth watching. Operation Overlord, D-Day. June 6, 1944, the largest armada in history, which is a military group of ships, crossed the English Channel and landed in Normandy, France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower led 1.5 million troops as they attacked the 5 beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Juno, Gold, and Sword. If you take a look here, you can see this is where we were attacking in Normandy. The Americans were responsible for Utah and Omaha. They also dropped in the 82nd Airborne Division right behind Utah Beach. And the British were responsible for Gold and Sword, while the Canadians had Juno Beach. If you ever watch Band of Brothers, which is on Amazon Prime, I believe, it's a really, really good representation of what this is like. You can see that the American Airborne, they dropped in and they were all over the place. They were scattered by Carentan and St. Lo and Valgones and all these different places. So they were scattered all over the place. And so part of the reason why we were so successful come June 6, 1944, was because the Nazis had these reports of soldiers all over the place. They knew American soldiers were everywhere. And so this created the impression that a lot larger number of soldiers had landed and the Nazis were absolutely freaking out. They thought people were behind them. They had no idea, and it was super, super confusing. And so this misdirection and this confusion made it a little bit easier for the troops that were invading the beachheads. Allied estimates are around 2,500 soldiers died on D-Day during the invasion, and another 7,500 were wounded. The victory in Normandy allowed for a supply chain to be set up, funneling 1.5 million troops into France. So if you look, you can see this is what the American soldiers and the British and Canadian soldiers saw when they got out of their amphibious vehicles. They pulled up to the beach, the door would fall down, and basically hell on earth would open up. There were machine guns flying. There were anti-tank obstacles on the beaches that basically did not allow for any vehicles to get onto the beach. There was barbed wire all over the place. These guys had to run and take cover and eventually amass on the dunes before attacking the German-held bunkers. There's a really good opening scene in Saving Private Ryan that is very graphic, but also pretty realistic in showing you what this was like. Lots of people were dismembered, lost limbs, people got shot and died. Oftentimes, some soldiers would have trouble because they were carrying these 50 or 60-pound packs when they jumped into the water, and so suddenly you're trying to sort of swim through the water with a 60-pound weight on your chest, which was extremely difficult, and so soldiers had to cut themselves free. In addition, their last meal before they went, a lot of soldiers were given ice cream and coffee and cake and a lot of food, and so they were getting seasick as they crossed the English Channel. And so you're puking, you're dehydrated, you're wearing a 60-pound weight, and then you're thrown into the water and people are firing machine guns at you. And it's completely understandable to see why casualties were so high. The victory in Europe was hard fought. The British, Canadian, and American troops closed in on the Nazis from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. Hitler and his high command were trapped by the Allies, and both the US and UK forces in the USSR moved towards Germany. They started to slowly crush in on Hitler. So from D-Day, June 6, 1944, to when the war ends, at the end of April, essentially, in 1945, they really make quick progress. They go through Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and eventually into Germany itself. As the Soviets are coming in the opposite direction, they take over Poland and all those little countries. They take over Hungary. And so the Germans realize that their days are numbered. As Allied forces neared Germany in a last desperate-ditch attempt to sort of stop the Americans, the Nazis pushed back as hard as they could against the Allies. American troops were trapped in the winter of 1944 as they were surrounded by the Nazis. This was called the Battle of the Bulge. So essentially, you had Soviet troops surrounding a group of Americans. If you look right here, you can see the Soviets are these red lines, and right here in the middle of this, at Bastogne, is an American airborne division, and they are basically all by themselves, surrounded by Nazis with no reinforcements. Sometimes the U.S. military would try to fly over and drop supplies to them, but it would just fall to the Nazis. Again, there's a really, really good episode of Band of Brothers, which follows the 1st Airborne Division, where you can see what the Battle of the Bulge was like. They were frozen solid. They were, starving. They were hiding in foxholes that were covered in snow. Sometimes German soldiers just on patrol would accidentally wander through their lines. It was just a huge, huge mess. And there were very, very little resources. So if you got wounded or if you got hurt, there was nowhere to retreat to. The men survived the Battle of the Bulge, and they lived through extreme cold and had very few supplies. Supplies were dropped to the men, but often ended up in German hands. General George Patton and his men drove them back, rescuing the men trapped at Bastogne. Again, if you haven't read the book Band of Brothers or seen the HBO series, I'd strongly recommend it with your time off here. Nazi Germany falls. As Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany, Hitler and his high command hid in the bunkers of Germany in Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler commits suicide, and Germany surrenders 9 days later. You can see there's Hitler and his wife. They got married at the end, Eva Braun. He commits suicide, and the bodies are destroyed because they want to make sure that he does not fall into the hands of the Allies. So that's going to do it for our notes, number 50, the European Theater. Tomorrow we'll take a look at the Pacific Theater. It's really, really hard to sort of do the whole war kind of like this because it was such a big deal. So hopefully you guys will be back in class soon. Anyways, if you like the notes kind of videos, leave a comment and let me know. If you'd prefer something where I'm talking with like visuals popping up, I can do that too. That's more like the Blitz video, which I'll also link in this Google Classroom. So let me know, and I hope you guys have a great time and enjoy the beautiful weather, and make sure you get outside and just stay away from people, and make sure you wash your hands and do everything that you're supposed to do. All right. Bye.